Dobar dan, dobrodošli na Historični seminar. Danes gostimo Vladimira Petrovića, kolega Vlada, drag prijatelj, je zgodovinar, je diplomiral iz sodobne zgodovine na Univerzi v Beogradu in doktoriral in tudi magistriral v Beogradu ter doktoriral iz primerjalne zgodovine na Centralnoevropski univerzi, ki je tedaj bila v Budimpešti, danes je žal na Dunaju. Podoktorski študij z področja tranzicijske pravičnosti je potekal na Inštitutu za vojno, holokaust in študije genocida v Amsterdamu, inštitut, s katerim tudi danes sodeluje. Raziskuje politično nasilje in strategije soočanja z njegovo zapuščino, konkretno predvsem z vojnami ob razpadu Jugoslavije, politično mobilizacijo, ki je temu predhodila, ter sojenje za vojne zločine, ki so potekala pred mednarodnim sodiščem za nekdanjo Jugoslavijo, tako imenovani Haški tribunal. S Haškim tribunalom je tudi sodeloval kot svetovalec oziroma raziskovalec ter s tožilstvom za vojne zločine Republike Srbije. Predaval je na Univerzi v Bostonu, na CEU, na Harvard Extension School ter danes poučuje na Univerzi v Amsterdamu. Je eden od koordinatorjev Nevedne univerze Ukrajine, ki jo organizira Centralnoevropska univerza, predvsem za ukrajinske študente od začetka vojne. In ima raziskovalno profesuro na Inštitutu za novejšo zgodovino, ki je njegov matični dom celo kariero. Je avtor vrste knjig in publikacij, tukaj so le nekatere, ter tudi zbirka virov. Eden od njih je mogoče posebej za nas zanimiv, to je zbirka dokumentov predsednictva SFRJ iz leta 1991 in zbirka Vojna v Sloveniji, Rat v Sloveniji. Od njegovih avtorskih knjig pa bi izpostavila The Emergence of Historical Forensic Expertise, Cleo Takes the Stand, ki analizira, kako so zgodovinari postali sodni izvedenci v pomembnih nacionalnih in mednarodnih pravnih postopkih v 20. stoletju. Ter njegova zadnja knjiga Etnično čiščenje, ki je ena vrsta begrifske šihte pojma etnično čiščenje, posebej s fokusom na našo regijo. No, danes bo Vlada reflektiral o v bistvu letih svojega raziskovanja na temo razpada Jugoslavije. Vlado, izvoli.
Hvala najlepše. And thank you so much for this kind invitation. As Jovana mentioned, well, I'm a bit embarrassed, I have to say, because now that I listen to my biography as edited by her, I hardly feel as such a person. So I thank you for the invitation and also for huge responsibility, which is to talk about an important topic of new directions in the studies of Yugoslav collapse. As Jovana mentioned, I was engaged in this topic for 15 or even 20 years so far, and I think that there are many more people who are able to talk about it much more competently than me. However, given that I was changing locations so abruptly, as Jovana mentioned, I was working in Belgrade and then in Budapest and then in Amsterdam, Boston and back, I was in a situation to zoom in and zoom out oftentimes, and I was thinking that probably this gives me some right to say a couple of things about something which I find extremely important. What I want to talk today is not about why Yugoslavia collapsed, why war erupted, who is to blame, who is to praise, and so on. I want to point out and direct your attention to the fact that next year we are looking ahead of 30 years from Srebrenica, from Oluja, from Dayton, and so on. And 30 years is a huge chunk of time, extremely important for the future of study of this phenomenon. Why so? For several reasons. The first reason is intergenerational. The students who are going to study, let's say next year, were born after Milosevic's death. The students who are now graduating are simply not aware of what was happening during the Yugoslav crisis of 1980s and so on. Their experience is not experience of contemporaries. That creates a unique, different situation. We don't really know actually what are the ramifications of that, but what I can tell you for sure is that we will find ourselves in completely different surroundings when those people take the fore and when they look into the situation anew. On the other hand, they will of course build on the shoulders of giants, and they are going to have to look into what we did beforehand in order to proceed and in order to map out the field. So the first reason why I think that the new directions are coming anyhow is simply intergenerational. There is another reason which prompted me to ground this conversation that we are going to have in the vogue, in the spirit of the new directions. Many things are changing in the area of Yugoslav studies in terms of sources. Some sources which are unavailable so far are becoming rapidly available. Even in archival legislation, 30 years in most of the Yugoslav successor countries is a cutoff index after which many documents which are not accessible are becoming growingly accessible. On the other hand, Yugoslavia doesn't exist anymore, and it doesn't really have archival infrastructure of any kind as a dead, non-existent country, but those things are scattered from archives of the successor states to America and back and various other places, the Hague Tribunal and so on and so forth. So basically, what we are having is a situation which is rather confusing and extremely challenging to digest this huge avalanche of sources. Thirdly, the world had changed immensely. What seems to be common sense in 1991 or 1995 is not a common sense anymore. And this turnover of 30 years, and if you just look at the 2 last years, we are going to see that the questions that are being posed now about the dissolution of Yugoslavia are qualitatively different. What we see now is that war is becoming a normalcy again, unfortunately, all over the world. It's not such an excess as it was in 1991. So for all these reasons, actually, I think it makes sense to have a pause, breathe in, and try to see where we are. Are we any smarter than we were 30 years ago, and where could we potentially proceed? This is more or less the roadmap of this talk. I will try to keep it extremely friendly and also extremely short, not to talk more than 40 minutes, because indeed I'm more interested in what you have to say than what I have to say on the topic. You will see behind me the abstract of what I aimed to say, which is of course to see what do we have so far and how can we potentially proceed. I don't think I have to remind anybody what is the phenomenon that we are interested in, the Yugoslav wars. This is the slide that I usually give to my students, and that slide actually attests to my own ignorance. You will see that usually I tell them, especially if they come from abroad, especially if they don't have any knowledge on Yugoslavia, I tell them, well, there were 4 wars, and they resulted in around 130,000 fatalities and ethnic homogenization of the Southeastern European space and all that. And it dawned to me only last year, I think, that I succeeded after 15 to 20 years of working in that field to omit 1 war, the war in Macedonia. It simply never occurred to me that I should put it there. Or perhaps to bundle it with Kosovo and claim that this entire theater of war can also be seen as one huge, and so on. And I kept thinking, how did it happen to me? I'm supposed to know that. Actually, fatalities of the war in Macedonia pretty much mirrored fatalities of war in Slovenia, if not more. And then I understood that basically, in a sense, I was a victim of a certain and extremely powerful paradigm. When I was a student, my first socialization into wars in former Yugoslavia came more or less from a very important project which was done by Alan Little and Laura Silber. It resulted in a book, Death of Yugoslavia, in 1995, which was expanded into a BBC documentary in 1996 of the same name. It's an excellent documentary. It lasts for hours and hours in 6 small chunks. For those of you who do not know, the impact of that documentary is enormous. They were able to persuade almost everybody to partake. They had interlocutors such as Milosevic, Boris Savjovic, Tudjman, Kučan, and 150 other personalities. I think only the federal government wasn't really, Ante Markovic didn't give an interview, the military leadership didn't talk with them, Kadijević, Adžić, and so on. But they did such extensive interviews and they did such good editing that when you look at it even today, you are sucked into a dialogue between politicians because they very shrewdly took sentences from different people and made it flow in a narrative arc, which sometimes make me think that even 30 years after that thing was made, we are still sort of filling the blanks and putting small pieces of puzzle which was pre-made in 1996. Fortunately, this was not such a bad framing and we can still work with that. But as a professional, as a historian, I found myself really, I was thinking, is it possible that for 15 years I'm using the same entry point to my students to socialize them into the Yugoslav collapse. And then I reflected a bit upon it, and I understood that I do it also partially out of laziness. It's easier for me because I know what is it about, and it's easier for them because it makes them flow and it makes them believe that they know what was going on. That's a dangerous belief, of course. The documentary, which I still praise very much, was made while the war was still lasting, basically. It was absolutely instant approach. Very important at the time, but still. The second thing, it was relying heavily on interviews with the participants. The problem being that almost all of those participants were politicians. And politicians, among many virtues they might have, sincerity and commitment to truth is not usually ranked high. So we don't really have any reason to take at face value whatever they have to say. And ultimately, the fact that you juxtaposed two people who are trying to deceive you doesn't mean that you came to the truth. That means that you might have been a victim to two propagandas and so on. And that leads me to another issue. From the very beginning, Yugoslav war was strange insofar as memoirs appeared even during the war. Sometimes the process wouldn't even end yet and somebody would sit and write memoirs. Sometimes with tragic and sometimes with comical outcomes. For instance, Boris Saviovic, whom you might or might not remember as one of the last presidents of the presidency, in 1995 wrote memoirs called The Last Days of SFRJ, to Milosevic's complete shock, because Boris Saviovic was combining extreme honesty with quite a lack of intelligence and insight and so on. And he gave actually excellent material to the Hague Tribunal, to the ICTY, to try and make an indictment against Milosevic. He was interested in his place in history, Jovic. Milosevic was not so much interested in his place in history so as to go to jail. So he wasn't happy about his closest associate memoirs. The other examples are even more hilarious. Former Croatian President Mesić, whom you might remember from the episode when he stopped being president of the presidency in Yugoslavia, gave a talk in Croatian parliament that his task is done and Yugoslavia exists no more and so on. His first edition of memoirs was called Kako smo srušili Jugoslaviju, How We Destroyed Yugoslavia. Years passed, Mesić changed, and I think really profoundly changed, I'm not even joking. And the second issue of the same memoirs, similar, he didn't change the content a lot, but the title was different. Not anymore Kako smo srušili Jugoslaviju, but Kako je srušena Jugoslavia, How was it destroyed, and so on. I'm not saying this to ridicule, those are all very valuable sources. I'm just saying that we need to be prudent and find the ways to inspect those sources for what they are. Accounts of people heavily vested to legitimize whatever they were doing or not doing. But just like the documentary whom I mentioned, we kind of suffered from these serious blows of sequence of memoirs which appeared while memories were yet fresh but not reflected upon. And these are not the only ones. Kondra Kolšek, Janez Drnovšek wrote an interesting book called Escape from Hell and so on. So Janša. So yeah, they all left a trace. But it's just a trace for us. We are supposed to research on it, not just import whatever they have to say. Then instant histories appeared. Still, some of the key books that we are using, that I'm assigning to my students, again, partially out of lack of, well, I'll see why I don't do that, were made in the second half of 1990s. Susan Woodward's Balkan Tragedy. I put here things on a random because, you know, there are thousands of bibliographical units in connection to the collapse of former Yugoslavia. Here I have Woodward, Balkan Tragedy, James Gow, Triumph of the Lack of Will, Robert Hayden's Blueprints for the House Divide, and Schopenberg, The War in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Those books appeared between 1997 and, let's say, 2002. The blood was still in the air. They are great books. Mostly those are not historians because historians prefer to wait for 50 years or so while contemporaries are out of the picture and so on. But still, they showed a certain way. In some cases, the same authors continued reflecting on the previous books they did. In this case, for instance, Hayden wrote this first book, and then his essays from Yugoslavia to the Western Balkans are largely relying on his reflections on his previous book. So that shows that there is certain continuity, and actually those are very useful books. To take another example, Josip Glavorić wrote a book, The Hour of Europe, along the similar topic as Gao, and indeed I can see that he was building on whatever Gao did before, using the increased accessibility of sources, especially from different points of European community and members of the European Union Foreign Affairs archives and so on. So I'm not saying that we should just now discard some histories because they were instant. I'm just saying that it's a weird phenomenon that many key books appeared while the war was still lasting. The problem with that, of course, is that if you write immediately after the war, you are under immense pressure. I'll give you an example. I mentioned the book by Gao and by Hayden. Both Gao and Hayden were witnesses in the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. For those who do not know, ICTY was founded on paper in '93, and it started working seriously from '95. And basically it worked for a quarter of a century in some sense. Quarter of a century is a lot of time. It indicted 161 persons, left an immense paper trail. And so many of the people who wrote books about the collapse of Yugoslavia ended up as expert witnesses in the tribunal. This is in connection to one of the books that Jovana kindly mentioned. Now, I don't know if any one of you was an expert witness in any trial. It can be really frustrating and sometimes funny experience as well. The judges are forcing a social scientist to explain them things. I will never forget that in the first trial to Duško Tadić, James Gao of King's College was an expert witness, and the judges were tormenting him to talk to them about the Middle Ages. Gao is a political scientist. Middle Ages in the Balkans are not his forte. And here you will see that no matter how much he would try not to start with the Middle Ages, after he solemnly declared that he will speak truth and nothing but the truth, the judges were insisting on the 14th century. Can you explain us the 14th century and so on and so forth? I wasn't good in history in school, so tell me everything. And then Gao tries to explain that he's not a historian either, and he's not sure that if he starts with 14th century, whether he will ever make it to the actual topic. But as you can see from this slide, they were just insisting. They were really curious to hear about the 14th century. And by the end of this slide, you will see Gao, abandoning everything and saying, since the late Middle Ages, the Balkans were the contested area between Orthodoxy and, Catholicism, and then the Ottomans came in, and so on and so forth. So that was the immediate post-war period. Those are certain weaknesses of creating instant histories. You also well know that there had been huge attempts in the second half of '90s and early 2000s of so-called conciliatory historiography. The one was, in a sense, even written in the Hague Tribunal. This is the building that you can see over there through different judgments and processes. But also many were created through huge projects, of which I will just mention two, because I suspect that some of you had been involved in it, and indeed I was. One was the project called Confronting Yugoslav Controversies, led by Charles Ingrao and Thomas Emmerich. They both assembled huge teams around, let's say, 15 overarching topics. Every team had a so-called mixed population of scholars from abroad and former Yugoslavia, always from several republics at the same time. And the idea was to show that, well, reasonable people can reasonably create some account acceptable everywhere from Triglava to Đevđelije. It worked and it didn't work at the same time. The other approach and the other idea was to create an ongoing dialogue, of which the most consistent one was dialog povjesničara I historičara, which produced volumes and volumes of conversations, mostly between Croatian and Serbian historians. Bosnians were there as well. I don't know how many Slovenes partook. I'll have to check, but volumes and volumes which still stand there somewhere on my shelves, showing rather, I think I would sum it up as like we agree to disagree, more or less, but we are happy to understand over what we actually disagree. So it still wasn't a lot to work with. But what I can tell you is that on the top of all this, now we are facing the avalanche of literature. Unfortunately, Rusko Matulić is not among us. I don't know how many of you heard his name. An excellent guy. While we were all writing and this and that, he was just sitting there in the US and creating bibliographies. So he came up with the bibliography of sources on the region of former Yugoslavia, fortunately before his death, which includes thousands and thousands of references to various issues relating to not only war, but also economy during war, social life during war, every aspect of life that you can imagine. Not only in English, but also in French and in German and in Italian, and of course in all shapes, shades of South Slavic languages. It's a mess. I didn't even read his bibliography until the end. let alone everything which is in that bibliography. What I mean to say is that there is no single person who can dare to say, well, let me tell you why did Yugoslavia break apart, let me tell you why war in Bosnia started, and so on. Very difficult. There are different ways to overcome it. It's possible. One way, for instance, Catherine Baker relatively recently, in 2015 or 16, made a very, very, very short book called The Yugoslav Wars of the 1990s. And she demonstrated there that it's quite possible to give a relatively short account on what was happening. I also use it as a segue with the students to get some elementary understanding of personalities, locations, key events. So one can approach it in a textbook-like fashion, or one can do it the other way around and go very extensively, such as the colleague from my Belgrade Institute, Kosta Nikolic, who wrote 3 extremely thick volumes on the collapse of Yugoslavia, and he is still not yet even in 1993. So he was using a lot of primary documents, and so let's say that Catherine is basically synthesizing and he is going deep into the topic. Why is Costa going so deeply in the topic? Simply because there are sources. There are many more sources that we can possibly handle. As I mentioned, 30 years are important for archival legislation of many countries, but even much before those 30 years, due to the activity of the Hague Tribunal and due to the activity of various other agencies, CIA, national security elements in the US, local courts in Serbia, in Bosnia and Croatia, all that meant that much more material than usual was available for the 90s than, let's say, for the 80s. So if you were researching in 2010, it would be easier to take such crown jewels as, for instance, Supreme Defense Council meetings of Milosevic and the rest, than to get minutes from the presidency of Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia from 1970s. So the 70s were much harder to, in some ways, cover in documents than the 90s. And then, of course, since 90s are very important and I think in many ways formative for most people under this roof, we all jumped and said, okay, fine, great. We have the Hague Tribunal. The Hague Tribunal accused 161 persons. The testimonies, there were over 4,500 witnesses. Each of those testimonies is an important and valuable piece of the puzzle. Fine, let's work with those testimonies. That was, in a sense, somewhat beneficial because the Hague Tribunal accused both people who were high up and who were foot soldiers, which also means that we got both the insight of those who were in the most important positions, but occasionally we would get a lot of everyday experience, let's say, of people. And by the way, I forgot, but this is why I didn't choose randomly the front page of the presentation. What I meant to say is that the war, as Stanja always wisely points out to us, is not only about people giving each other ashtrays and deciding let's conquer this or let's conquer that, but it's actually about millions of people who somehow have to live through that damn thing. And so most of those people we will all recognize, such as Milosevic. As years are passing by, memories are fading. I don't think that even this guy is known to everybody, the guy below Milosevic. I'm not going to quiz you, we are all friends, but that's Blagoje Adžić, the deputy, the head of the general staff of the Yugoslav People's Army in 1991. But they are kind of recognizable. But what of all those many other people? This guy here is probably well known. I don't know, actually, I should ask if anybody knows who is the guy who looks like a bush here. You know him, yes, you all know him from the very interesting visual which appeared at the beginning of war in Slovenia. UTEL television came to him and asked him to give assessment of the situation, and he said, I don't know, they kind of want to secede, we are kind of preventing them. All I know is that I'm here and I wouldn't like to be here, and so on and so forth. His name was Bahrudin Kaletović. He was serving in the Yugoslav People's Army. Afterwards, he was also serving in Croatia, and then afterwards he re-emerged in the army of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and then ultimately he died. Out of all these wars, he died in a traffic accident in 1997, I believe. About the guy above him, I might speak at some point, but given that I said it's going to be 40 minutes, I will not. What I want to say, it's not all about Milosevic and Kučan and this guy and that guy, but it's about many of our contemporaries who are bearing scars and traumas of different kind from that war, who had to change their national identity and their worldview dramatically under shocking circumstances since, let's say, Tito's death until, I don't know, 5 years ago. And by the way, these effects are nowhere done in places like Kosovo, Bosnia, and so on. And I think in some sense it's our duty to understand this transgenerational challenge which is ahead of us. So, thousands of testimonies. 100-something thousand of documents from the Hague Tribunal are publicly available through the judicial database of the of the Hague Tribunal. We use them every now and then and misuse them in a sense. I think I have to make tangible what does it mean, 100,000 documents, because it doesn't sound like a lot. You think, okay, well, let's just put them in ZASU and that's fine, but you cannot. It's a lot. Most of those are very, very long as well. If you zoom in only on one of 161 trials, which is Milosevic's trial, I did the statistic for you, what are we dealing with. Only in Milosevic's trial, which was okay, the biggest, but on the other hand, it didn't finish. You would be confronted with all in all 45,000 pages of transcript, which contains these 400 witness statements as testimonies. Then the exhibits easily additional 100,000 pages and so on. Multiply that with how much you can read over your lifetime, and you can only easily understand that there cannot be an expert even in Milosevic's trial, because you have to read all that. That can be done only by a team, not by a single person. And again, that's only one trial that we are talking about, plus many videos which are very lengthy and so on. So we have a lot, much more than for one person, but to make the situation even more worse, we have a lot, but it's just floating on an even bigger sea. The Hague Tribunal has about 100-something thousand documents which are publicly accessible, but since I was a privy to the database of the tribunal, that's also floating on 2 million of documents which the prosecution gathered. And that one is not accessible. So you have like millions of documents which are gathered somehow. That somehow means that these are not normal archives. It's not like Ministry of Industry of Slovenia said something to the archives of Slovenia and so on and so forth. No, it's a catch-as-catch-can type of a thing. Some of those were top secrets. Some of those, you all remember what happened when Mesić brought Topnički diaries to the Hague Tribunal and all those things. Many of these documents are under lock. And then the problem is in the following. What if, for instance, there is a lot of documents for indictment of somebody, but then that somebody died? The indictment was never made. That just means that those documents were never included into those which are accessible. Trials, as you all know, are very powerful beams, like this ray of light, which means that they put something under the light, and you see that very closely. But all of those things which are not encompassed by the indictment, by the trial, and so on, are just remaining in the shade. I think everybody remembers famous non-existent defense of Franjo Tuđman in the Hague Tribunal, časni sude, nisam živ, like I'm not alive. So basically he was not indicted by the Hague Tribunal. In some sense, posthumously, he is indicted because he features at almost all of the joint criminal enterprise indictments to, let's say, Bosnian Croats and so on. But in practice, then those documents leading in that direction will simply not be publicly accessible. And what I mean to say is that we just have to factor it in when we deal, we have to do with what we have, but at the same time we need to be extremely conscious of the fact that we might have something else which we simply overlook. Now, how to deal with all that? I'm trying to sketch the problem and to try to offer a certain solution. I will tell you firstly about my failed efforts to deal with the solutions. So I thought at a certain point that in Serbia, where there is no systematized effort in publishing sources about our recent history, my Institute for Contemporary History should make one such. And that we should use exactly these first preliminary exhibits from the Hague Tribunal as our starting point. I tried to select those which I found most interesting, and I focused only on 1991, thinking that it will create preconditions. Because publishing sources, as we all know, can be fairly neutral activity. It's never neutral, you always make choices, there is always an ideology behind it, but certainly it's not as abusive as, let me tell you what had happened and so on. Well, let's publish something, let's talk about it, something like that. That was the logic. We made, I think, around 10 volumes or so. Regarding 1991, we started with the documents of presidency of Yugoslavia from January to March, basically when you might remember that period when the coup d'etat was floating somewhere in the air. And then we focused on the deep spring and summer, which brought about war in Slovenia, and then another volume, which I apparently didn't take with myself, war in Croatia. And of course, we make it all available online. It gained some traction, but not enough actually to start a deeper conversation. And I have to say, and that is why I'm mentioning that these 30 years make a difference. In March 1991, there was a really weird session of the presidency of Yugoslavia where military high command was arm twisting. You all know that, arm twisting the political leadership to allow them basically to create coup d'etat. And that was the only transcript I couldn't find in the Hague Tribunal. And so in this book, I had to become is there somebody here who is a medievalist? Anybody dealing with the Middle Ages? I never thought I'm going to have to do that. That was the single most important session, and I couldn't find it in the Hague Tribunal. I couldn't steal it anywhere, find it, and so on. The only thing I could do was to reconstruct it the way people from the Middle Age are doing it. I found a video which the military counterintelligence made, which had like about 5% of that session filmed, and I used this as a basis. I was taking then excerpts which were published, small excerpts published by Drnovšek, Tupurkovsky, Jović, and so on, and tried to sort of wrap it in and reconstruct. Made 30 pages of the session. I was very proud of myself and whatnot. It's all there. And only last year that became publicly accessible in Belgrade, because even in Serbia, which is really probably not well known for its open access policies and archival disclosures, you can go there, and in Archives of Yugoslavia you can freely research on anything pertaining Yugoslav state secrets of late 80s and early 90s. Nobody cares, it's not a successor country, it's open, it's actually very well sorted out, to my surprise. So my colleague Katarina Beširović just went there the other day and she called me and she was like, hey, bingo, I found you the session that you've been talking about for 15 years. The problem is that the session is like 400 pages long, so it merits a whole new book. And I, out of naivete and best intentions, misled my audience, condensing it into 30 pages of something which is not really representative and is very important actually. Who was for introduction of martial law, who was not, why did the session last 3 days, why wasn't Drnovšek on the first session, who stalled and waited for him to come, why did this guy change his opinion, and so on and so forth. We are not asking the right questions because we don't really have always precondition to ask the right questions. Why don't we have a precondition to do that? Well, for several reasons. Firstly, as Yugoslavia doesn't exist, there is no immediate state interest of any of the successor states to have some sustained, comprehensive, critical, balanced interpretation of these events. These are basically semi-private initiatives of me and my colleagues. It's not that the lawmaker came and said, Vlado, please publish everything because we need to know. No, like it was like... the second thing is that we are losing interest of our audience. In early 2000, it would be fairly enough to dress like this, borrow a tie, go to a random Western embassy and say, I want to have a conciliation project, and then something like that would appear. Now you do that and they laugh at you. They're like, conciliation of whom? With whom? What's wrong here? I mean, look at this city, lovely city. Pristina also, lovely city, peaceful. People are not shooting each other at the streets, unlike in Lebanon, unlike in Mykolaiv and so on. So, you know, go on, my boy, and don't bother us any further. So we are losing the stuff that we more or less were accustomed to, which is the support of the West for these enterprises. But also we are losing the interest of the new generation, I think, which just comes there. They are in some ways products of this whole process. And it's not that they are so curious, You know how in Germany after 1968, famously, allegedly, everybody was asking, what did you do during the war, that, and so on. I don't think that this is really happening in the territory of the former Yugoslavia. And so I came up with all sorts of tricks, which are more or less moves of a desperate man, to virtualize some of these sources. We made a map in Belgrade, which is trying very much to put all these documents somehow on a timeline, to gamify it a bit for the students. I have zero idea what is the effect of that. I can't really both make it and track the effect. Let it remain for posterity. But I want you to show you how desperate I am. We ended up making a game as well. I talked for a long while with Mirko Klarin from Sense agency and from the Center for Transitional Justice in Pula about making a game which would put you in the role of Ante Marković during the early 1991. And he died. Well, both Marković and Klarin died. And then I was called by Sense. They told me that he would have liked it to be finished. So I finished it, and now you can play and try to see what would you do if you were Ante Marković. I know he's not the most popular person in Ljubljana, but try and play it. And it's also document-based. So your decisions, you might remember those books when we were kids. They were called Odaberi svoju pustolovinu, choose your own adventure. It's based on that philosophy, but it rather shows the problems that one has in order to engage people into reflecting on the former Yugoslavia. Publications of sources in Serbia are left in more or less in my feeble hands, which means that they dwindle to publications like this one. I see it's much more organized in Croatia, when there is an entire institute whose agenda I don't share at all, but I have to admire their stamina. I think they have like 27 volumes of different sources about the war in Croatia. And fine, one can work with that. That's great. Božo Repe published 3 volumes on Slovenian independence, also very useful to understand what's happening. In our case, not so useful because, again, it's ramshackled. And this is the example. So I published the whole volume a couple of years ago, and now this volume is rendered more or less useless by these recent findings of my colleague, which are telling about this whole session. And I would like to say that this is the end, but in a sense, this is beginning for several reasons. As year goes by, we will have new revelations. CIA, every 5 or 6 years, discloses about 100,000, even 1 million documents pertaining to everything and nothing. A lot of it about Yugoslavia. Us, being unprepared, we just jump on that and then we take a random document and say, aha, do you see, CIA actually supported this side or that side? But no, all the documents are coming from a certain context. If you don't understand the context and the production, then basically you are not valuing that document in a professional way. You are just taking it to confirm your bias that it's all Genscher's fault, it's all Milosevic's fault, it's all Vatican, I don't know. In the interest of this new generation, 30 years after, we might want to do our last hooray and leave them some more stable and critical legacy. Because ultimately it doesn't matter, I know you will not agree, but it doesn't matter so much who destroyed Yugoslavia and so on and so more. What matters much more is actually to think about processes of disintegration and to think how easily a certain apparently stable situation can end up in a complete catastrophe. You can't really come to some definitive conclusions about these things. You have to rethink it anew. We didn't do that. I didn't do that. It's not that I'm blaming you. I didn't do it. I was the one giving this death of Yugoslavia left and right, instead of doing the right thing, which would in this case be to go to London, to King's College, where the archives of the death of Yugoslavia documentary are. Now I'm old and frail, but I could send a student, and he did go there. And what did he find? 116 interviews with all the participants. They are all book length and so on. And those were the bases back to the death of Yugoslavia, according to which this lovely narrative was made. The narrative is lovely, but professionals should really just take all those huge statements of Tuporkovsky, Kolchak, I don't know, many people you hear, just see some. Digitize, print it out, machine learning, I don't know, but get acquainted with that, not with a catchy sentence. And of course, that would be just the beginning. So this is, for instance, one of those things. This is Milosevic's statement to the, and it's not the only one. Slobodna Evropa had a huge set of interviews called Svjedoci Raspada with such people as Begović, Raif Dizdarević, many others. That cannot be disregarded. It has to be scrutinized, and it has to be juxtaposed to one another. This is, of course, this wrong way to approach new huge disclosures. CIA disclosure, and everybody goes crazy and looks at it. Then there is another disclosure of the German archives, and then people are again cherry picking. I think it's an almost textbook example of how not to write history, and in some sense it's also a consequence of general speeding up of everything and the algorithmization of our lives and the nature of media. Everybody is going for a clickbait, and it doesn't make for a good clickbait to say we need to look at many documents even-handedly for years and somehow try to come up with a balanced interpretation which will be in the best interest of us and our kids. Not a good clickbait. Given all that, and to bring this to a swift conclusion, the famous question of Lenin and the others. So what is to be done? Clearly, collapse of Yugoslavia is still something worth pondering on. And I think not only in the former Yugoslavia, and I will explain in a second why. I have a couple of suggestions which I find relatively reasonable. One of the biggest problems when discussing this process is that people are constantly confusing the process of dissolution and disintegration and war. I never understood why. I know that they overlapped chronologically, but for the life of me, I can understand at least four scenarios. Yugoslavia could have dissolved in war, which is what had happened. Yugoslavia could have dissolved peacefully, which is what not had happened. Yugoslavia could have been kept together peacefully, which is not what had happened. And Yugoslavia could have been held together through war, which is also not what had happened. So what I mean to say is that dissolution and war are interlinked but not the same. So it's kind of pointless to chase those who are, let's say, guilty for dissolution and to say that they are also guilty for war, because those might not be the same people. 10 years is a long period of dissolution, and indeed, Slovenia doesn't really have a lot to do with wars in Kosovo and Albania. And from what I saw, when they were happening for Slovenia, it was as interesting as if it was happening in Sierra Leone. Well, not really, but let's say it wasn't such a hot topic, and so on and so forth. So distinguishing with that. Definitely moving away about who is to blame to much more traditional and boring issue of trying to understand to the best of our abilities what had actually happened. Because the blame game, I'm also guilty of it. Nothing better to think of yourself as a judge who is going to say Milosevic is guilty. No, actually it's Kučan. Look at them shaking hands here. No, it's the Croats. No, it's Genscher. Makes one feel really important, but actually that's not what I was paid and trained to do. I just felt the need to do that. The need is nice, but it was, I think, somewhat misguided. Taking a detailed stock on the sources which are available, and again, this is mostly directed toward historians. I know that many of you are coming from disciplines for which this is not so important. But if historians don't do that part of a job, then you cannot use it and despise us at the same time. So, so it's mostly meant for my colleagues which actually are indeed trained to do that, to take a stock of what is available and to try to see what to do with it. And so, of course, moving away from political history towards social history, and that's why I spent some time on Bahrudin Kaletović and the other people, victims, many victims, perpetrators, many perpetrators, bystanders, many bystanders. In many ways, we are all bystanders. I certainly was. Political history can not tell us a lot about it. Social history can ultimately tell us why we turned out now what we are now, in some ways. Perhaps, I don't know. But dealing with the social, economic dimension of war, nobody is going to persuade me that this is irrelevant. Economic dimension of war is probably the most relevant. It's just that we never had economic crimes trials, but war crimes trials. Importantly, nobody wants to live next to a mass murderer. But then this is the beam. The beam was on war criminals, and so the beam was not so much on tycoons and war profiteers. And I would be surprised if there were not any in the highest echelons of social, economic, and political life, even in Slovenia, let alone in Serbia. But nobody put them to trial, so we don't know. And there is a reason why those people were not put to trial. I suspect because they are powerful enough not to be put on trial, whereas an ordinary war criminal, not so much. One other thing, and I'm now really coming to an end. The process of dissolution of Yugoslavia is very interesting for us because we were entangled in it. It's not at all interesting to anybody else for its own sake. So many times sitting in Boston, I'm reading the news from this part of the world, complete mismatch. Like you have news which are completely Belgrade-centered or Ljubljani or Balkan-centered, like, oh, they are doing this for us, we have problem here and so on. In the United States, I wanted so much to write this op-ed, but I would feel like crying every time, which would be called Nikom Bitni, important to nobody. If entire Balkans just disappeared, like poof, from the map, fell into the sea, with Romania, and so on, 50 million people even, all in all, including Slovenia, I don't think it would make a news, or a big news in New York Times, let's say. It would be news like some, freaky accident, like this worm from Dune came and like engulfed everything. But economically speaking, politically speaking, so and so. I think that for our people it's almost impossible to deal with that horrible fact of life. And therefore they go into this daydreaming that like everybody is thinking how to restructure Bosnia, how to make stable peace. No, actually nobody is thinking. Which makes me conclude that the only way to approach these issues is at the same time comparative and transnational, and to show that these are the processes which matter on their own for us, but they also matter for somebody else and for some other contexts. I mean, after all, Yugoslavia was a multinational, multi-ethnic con or federation which fell apart. I can think of another multi-ethnic confederation, such as European Union, which might be interested to see why this Yugoslav experiment was not successful, especially at the times when European experiment is put under such enormous pressure. And therefore, what I mean to say is that I clearly envisage what is it to be done. I just don't know how to do it, which is to make a huge network. Horizon projects of EU are, of course, an obvious choice to do it, and to have a stable trickling of research of all these different aspects that I just mentioned, hoping that some insights could be created. The funny thing is that I could tell you at length what should be done, what I think should be done, how should we consult, and so on. But the funny thing is that I was never able to understand who should be the lead partner in such a project and who should be the principal investigator. And I was thinking this morning, like, what should I tell today? I thought, yeah, I know why is that the problem. If I could tell you now who could be the good lead investigator, lead partner and principal investigator, then there wouldn't be no dissolution of Yugoslavia and Yugoslav wars. Pretty much the research of Yugoslavia suffers from the same problem as Yugoslavia. You can't find an institution that is credible enough to create such even-handed cooperation of goodwill. However, I think we should all make an honest effort, and I'm happy to talk about it with you, well, as long as I can be here. So I thank you for your patience. I could tell you many other things which came to my mind, but I think I would overstay my welcome. And let's start talking about it finally. So thank you once again for this patience.